My name is Cheryl, and I'm 28 years old. Right now, I'm focused on building my career, and I live with my husband, Brian. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about starting a family, but Brian feels we should wait. He believes that before we have children, we should first build a house and settle down. Because of this, we're both saving money to make that dream happen. Even though I'm eager to start a family, Brian insists that we establish our home first. Whenever I bring up having children, he reminds me of this plan, saying it's essential to get a house in place before anything else. It's frustrating because I feel like my own wishes and opinions are being brushed aside. I feel like I have to work even harder now to add to our savings to make our dream of a house come true, hoping this might eventually lead to us starting a family. Brian and I have been married for a year now, and in this time, I've noticed some recurring patterns in our relationship. One thing that stands out is how Brian often dismisses my ideas and thoughts. This habit was present even when we were dating, and I thought it was simply because he had strong opinions and was confident. Back then, I even admired this quality in him. But now that we're married, I've come to realize how important it is for both of us to respect each other's perspectives. I worry about the future of our relationship, especially because Brian's parents are heavily involved in our lives. They live close by, just a short drive away, and Brian often visits them, saying he wants to save money by eating with them or spending less time at home. However, I've found out that he sometimes goes out with his coworkers for drinks, which he doesn't mention when he's talking about our spending. It's confusing because he's very strict about money with me, but is more relaxed when it comes to his own expenses. Brian's frugality extends to many little things, like turning off lights quickly or being careful with hot water. He often reminds me about saving in these small ways, yet he doesn't always apply the same standards to himself. This imbalance can make our relationship feel unfair, and it sometimes makes me frustrated and angry. He seems to think it's okay to enforce his ideas without taking my feelings or needs into account. Every week, we go to his parents' house, and each time, there's a new topic that adds pressure. My in-laws often bring up the idea of having grandchildren, saying things like, "Hasn't it been a year since you got married? When will we have some good news?" They look forward to meeting a grandchild, which only adds to the stress I feel around starting a family. When they say these things, I glance at Brian, sitting beside me, hoping he'll consider my feelings and understand the pressure I'm under. Right now, it feels like I'm caught between wanting to start a family and respecting Brian's wishes. I hope we can find a middle ground where we both feel understood and valued in our marriage. I can feel Brian's disapproving look. He seems to want me to stay quiet and not say anything that might upset his family. I want to have a child, but Brian keeps insisting that we must build our own house before starting a family. It frustrates me because his parents pressure me to have a child, even though Brian is the one who wants to wait. Instead of advising him to listen to my thoughts about children, they continue pushing me. After dinner, Brian stands up and says, "I'm going out for a smoke." While he's away, his parents turn to me and say, "Cheryl, it seems like you're working hard, but if you want to be a housewife, you should quit your job and focus on being a good wife." Maybe that's why Brian isn't ready to have kids yet. Hearing this makes me feel like they're blaming me for not having children because I have a job. I want kids more than anything, but Brian is the one holding back because he wants to focus on building a home first. My mother-in-law continues, "Just quit your job already." I feel my patience wearing thin, so I respond, "It was Brian who asked me to keep working. Why don't you talk to him first before telling me what to do?" I can't hold back my frustration and say, "I want children, too, but it's Brian who's not listening to me. He says we need to build a house first." Instead of lecturing me, "Why don't you talk to him?" My words surprise them, and they go quiet. I apologize quickly and leave the table, feeling a mix of anger and relief. I head to the door, where Brian is casually smoking. He doesn't say anything, and I walk straight to the car. He eventually joins me, looking surprised, and asks, "Are you leaving already?" I know he won't explain any of this to his parents, and I feel tired of all the expectations and pressures his family keeps placing on me. I tell him, "I don't think I want to come to your parents' house anymore." Brian looks at me, wide-eyed, and asks, "Why not? We save on food when we come here. Plus, don't you want a house and kids?" I feel fed up with both Brian's and his parents' expectations. They all talk about things we need to do to prepare for family, but no one is truly listening to what I want or how I feel. All the talk about saving money, quitting my job, and waiting for the right time makes me feel like I'm not being heard or valued in our relationship. It's overwhelming. I sit in the car, silent, wondering if things will ever change. Brian doesn't seem to understand my frustration, and his parents don't see how their comments affect me. It's exhausting to be in a position where everyone else's expectations and opinions seem more important than mine. I hope one day they can understand my side, but for now, I feel like I need some space from Brian, from his parents, and from all the expectations placed on me. I snapped, telling Brian, if you want to save money, I've told you many times, you could save more by cutting out your drinking nights or smoking. Why do you drive to your parents' house just to save on one meal? There are better ways to save. I was frustrated and continued, you keep putting all these rules on me, like not using hot water and making sure the lights are off by 11 p.m., but you never seem to make sacrifices yourself. You act like we can save all this money without changing anything about your habits. If I'm the only one making all these sacrifices, then maybe I don't want a house this badly. I'm tired of it. You don't give up anything, yet you expect me to. Brian tried to brush it off, saying it's not a big deal. But I fired back, no, it is a big deal. How much patience do you think I have? You act like I'm the reason we're not having kids, especially when your parents ask about grandchildren. It's not me who doesn't want children, it's you. I've been wanting kids for a long time, so stop acting like it's all on me. I could see that my anger surprised Brian, and a small part of me felt a little satisfaction seeing him struggle to respond. But it didn't solve anything. I was still frustrated, so I just looked out the car window, ignoring him. 2 months later, something happened that would change things between us. One of my relatives, my dad's brother, passed away. My uncle had been very successful. He had several pieces of land, a big mansion, and a very comfortable life. When Brian heard about this, he was surprised and said, "Wow, I didn't know you had such a well-off relative." A few days later, I received news about my uncle's inheritance. I decided to talk with the lawyer about the details in our apartment, where I felt comfortable. Since this inheritance only involved me, I thought it was best to handle it myself. I asked Brian if he could leave the room during the discussion. I could sense he felt uncomfortable about the idea of inheritance and didn't see it as something that involved him. As I spoke with the lawyer, I realized that this inheritance could give me the independence I had been missing. It wasn't just about the money or the property. It was a chance to make my own decisions, separate from all the rules and expectations Brian had been putting on me. For the first time, I felt I had options and a say in my future, which was refreshing after so many arguments and struggles about saving, sacrifices, and plans for a family. This inheritance gave me a sense of freedom and confidence that I had been craving for a while. It made me realize that I could have a voice and make my own choices without always compromising my desires for the sake of someone else's plans. I wanted to keep things simple and avoid any possible trouble for Brian, so I asked him to stay out of my meeting with the lawyer. After about 5 hours of going through the details of the inheritance, I thanked the lawyer and saw him out. But when I looked around, Brian was nowhere to be found. I figured he had left to give me space for the meeting, so I shrugged it off and started making dinner. For months passed without much mention of the inheritance. Then one day, Brian came to me and said, "I have something to show you." He seemed excited as he led me to the car, and I started feeling curious. We drove into a quiet residential area, and I couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and confusion as we pulled up to a house. Brian got out, walked up to the intercom, and pressed the button. I was even more puzzled when his parents opened the door and greeted us warmly. This wasn't their usual home. Brian's dad said with a big smile, "You finally made it. When are you moving in?" I felt completely lost and looked at Brian, waiting for him to explain. His dad continued, "We're thinking you and Cheryl should move here by the end of the month." That's when things started making sense, but it wasn't the answer I wanted. Brian's dad began scolding me, saying I was a selfish daughter-in-law and that I always blamed Brian for not having children yet. I shot a questioning look at Brian, wondering why he'd bring me here, especially since I had clearly told him I didn't want to visit his parents' house anymore. Trying to keep calm, I asked Brian what was going on. He shrugged and replied, "Don't get so mad. If we live together with my parents, it will help you and my mom get closer. Besides, this is our new home now, so we should work together on having kids too." His words shocked me. I never agreed to live with his parents, especially after everything that had happened. I had been clear about needing some space. But Brian then explained that this was a three-family house, saying, "The plan was always for us to live with my parents eventually. What's wrong with living in a three-family home now?" I felt a rush of emotions, anger, disappointment, and frustration. Living in a three-family house with his parents felt like too much, especially since we'd been saving up for our own home. Given our finances, this house was way beyond what we could afford. It was a beautiful, new home, something that didn't match our budget. I started piecing it together and realized Brian must have agreed to this plan with his parents without really talking to me about it. I felt trapped. He had made such a big decision without discussing it with me, putting our future in a place I didn't choose. It felt like my wishes didn't matter, and that hurt. I looked away, feeling more distant from Brian than ever before. This wasn't the life I had imagined or agreed to. I was in shock when Brian told me how he managed to afford the new house. "My dad and I pooled our money for it, so our savings are empty," he said casually, as if it were no big deal. He then added, "But you heard about your uncle's inheritance, right? It's worth $950,000. If you use that to help pay for the house, everything should be fine." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Brian actually thought it was okay to use my inheritance money to cover the cost of the house, without even asking me. Even if I did get that money, I felt it should be my decision on how it was used, not his. The idea that he had already assumed it was his to use was infuriating. When I told him I wasn't okay with his idea, he looked irritated and then reached into his bag, pulling out a divorce form already filled out with his name on it. "If you don't want to live with my parents, then let's just get a divorce," he said bluntly. I took the form from him, feeling a strange sense of relief. "Fine," I replied. "If living with your parents is the only other option, then divorce sounds better." I put the form in my bag and turned away from him and his parents, who looked completely shocked. Without looking back, I said, "By the way, I turned down my uncle's inheritance." Brian's face froze in confusion. Without waiting for him to respond, I walked out, leaving him and his stunned family behind. I took a bus back to our apartment, feeling a mix of anger and sadness, but also a sense of finality. When I got home, I pulled the divorce papers out of my bag, filled in my name next to Brian's, and decided to file them right away. After submitting the paperwork, I went to a nearby store to buy some cardboard boxes, ready to start packing up my things. Realizing the move would be too much for me to handle on my own, I called a moving company and luckily they had an open schedule, so I could move out quickly. As I packed, I heard loud noises from the front door. Brian had come back. I quickly put the chain lock on, feeling a bit uneasy about facing him when he was so upset. Through the door, I called out, "I'm keeping the chain on, Brian. I'm not sure how you'll act when you're this angry, so it's better this way." I waited by the door for a moment, but he didn't say anything. I wasn't sure if he would leave, apologize, or try to argue, but I was done waiting for his approval or permission. I had finally taken a step to claim my own future, without his expectations or his family's constant demands hanging over me. As I continued packing, I felt a mixture of sadness and freedom. It was the end of a chapter, but I felt strong knowing I was making decisions for myself for the first time in a long time. I didn't know what the future would hold, but at that moment, I was ready to move forward on my own terms. I was in the middle of packing for the move when Brian came to me and said, "I need you to stay at your parents' house for a few days. I won't accept a divorce." I looked at him in surprise and reminded him, "But you handed me the divorce papers, didn't you?" I could tell he didn't expect me to point that out, but I was determined to make him understand. "If you sign the divorce papers, it means you agree to the divorce. You can't say you don't accept it now." I was shocked by his response and wondered if he really understood what he was doing. He frowned, looking frustrated, but then quickly changed the subject, asking, "Why would you give up on a $950,000 inheritance? Normally, you would inherit it, right?" It was clear that Brian had heard about the inheritance, but he hadn't fully understood the situation. He probably rushed to my parents and, without fully thinking things through, helped them buy the three-family house. I took a deep breath and explained everything. The inheritance came to me because no one else wanted it. My two uncles had 5 sons for daughters, a 2-wife, and grandchildren, but they all decided to give up their share. So, it ended up coming to me, I told him. But the truth is, even though my uncle had $950,000, most of it was gone. He had to tear down his mansion, spend a lot on maintaining the land, and there was a lot of debt. When I looked at everything, I realized that giving it up was the best choice. Brian seemed completely shocked. He couldn't believe it. "No way," he exclaimed. "So, even if you had inherited $950,000, you're saying there wouldn't have been much left? That's fraud." I tried to stay calm and explained the lawyer and I talked everything through properly, but someone overheard the conversation and left before they heard the full story. I watched as he stood there, speechless. I could see that maybe he was starting to realize how wrong he had been about everything. But I wasn't done yet. "It's too late now," I said firmly. "You betrayed my trust. We've already filed for divorce, and we're no longer a couple. Why are you acting like you don't want to get divorced now? If you didn't want a divorce, you should have followed me when I left. You should have supported me, not let me walk away." I could tell his mind was racing as he tried to process everything, but I didn't let him off the hook. "Your mom's opinion about the divorce doesn't change anything. You and your dad invested in that 3-family house without thinking about what it meant. And your mom doesn't really understand money or work like you do. She can't appreciate what it takes to earn and save money." It was hard to see Brian so confused and frustrated, but I couldn't go back on my decision. I had been clear with him from the beginning, and now it was time for both of us to face the consequences of our actions. As I packed, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. I knew that this was the right choice for me, even though it was painful. It was time to move on and start a new chapter. I sighed, realizing it wasn't my job anymore to listen to Brian's complaints about his family. If we were still married, maybe I'd feel more willing to hear him out. But I reminded him, "You haven't filed the divorce papers yet, have you?" He looked at me, pleading, "If you don't file them now, we can still stay married. Please, let's live together in that 3-family house." I shook my head. "I've already submitted the divorce papers, so there's no turning back now," I replied. His face fell, and he stood by the apartment door, looking lost and unsure of what to do. I felt he had brought this on himself, but I also couldn't leave him standing there forever. I thought about asking him to leave, but I needed to stay focused on packing and getting ready for my move. After a while, he left quietly, and I went on with my preparations. I knew I needed to inform my workplace about the divorce, especially since my boss had tried to help us work things out before. I felt I owed him an explanation and an apology. During lunch, I also shared the news with a few coworkers who had been at our wedding. To my surprise, Brian showed up at my department that afternoon, clearly upset. In front of my coworkers, he said, "I can't believe you're discussing our divorce here. I wish you hadn't told anyone." He then explained what had happened on his side at work. Apparently, his coworkers had assumed I inherited a large estate and that we'd use it to buy the 3-family house. When he told them we were either going to live with his parents or get divorced, and that I had chosen divorce, they started avoiding him, seeing him in a different light. I even got some sympathy from colleagues who had heard the story. Eventually, things got so uncomfortable for him that he decided to quit his job. A little while later, something unexpected happened. One of my male coworkers, who I'd known for a while, came up to me. He confessed, "I've actually liked you for a long time. I hope someday to build a home where we can truly communicate and work together as a couple." Hearing him say that felt comforting and refreshing. After everything I'd been through with Brian, I realized how much I longed for a relationship based on understanding and real teamwork. I wanted a partner who would listen, make decisions together, and respect my feelings. This whole experience had been painful, but it also opened my eyes. I needed a relationship where both people were committed to each other's happiness and dreams, not just one side making all the sacrifices. Looking at my coworker, I thought maybe there was hope for that kind of future. As I continued to pack and prepare for my next chapter, I felt lighter and more hopeful. It was a fresh start, and I was ready to build a life where I could feel truly valued and heard.